Welcome back to Toasty Gaming. Today kicks off a hopefully recurring miniseries I'm calling Keeping Up with Games Journalism. Think of it as reality TV, except the drama comes from opinion pieces, not wine throwing. Episode 1 features Kotaku columnist John Walker and his article, Deep Breath, Every Argument for Why We Shouldn't Be Able to Skip Boss Fights at Rest. The headline promises calm logic. The body delivers a carnival of anxiety, Parisian catacombs, yes, Parisian catacombs, and a space moth named Chica, which caused a multi-decade trauma in the author. Make sure you're comfortable, and let's jump right in. To quickly map out the article, Walker spends roughly 3,000 words explaining to us, the unwashed masses, that every boss fight should ship with an official skip button. He opens by praising South of Midnight for adding such a toggle and notes that surprise civilization didn't collapse. Then he tells us that backlash to his earlier pieces triggered a bona fide anxiety attack. Then he mentioned that he got terrible death threats, which are obviously repugnant if real, though as always he doesn't provide any evidence, before then accusing the players of being extraordinarily hostile. With his martyr status established, he declares his mission to liberate the world from mandatory bosses. Now, I'm not someone to throw shade at anyone's Panic episode, but the pattern is rather familiar. First of all, some games journalist, in this case Kotaku, floats a scorched earth take. Then social media laughs at them, at least the 5 people who still care about what Kotaku has to say, and then the writer retells the laughs as some evil persecution of his person. Critique suddenly becomes a cruelty, disagreement becomes harassment, and the entire logic skates by under emotional fog. A personal pro tip for John from myself: if you truly need less venom in your mentions, then maybe don't spend the entire remainder of this article rather obviously throwing shade at your readers and constantly coming off as some kind of entitled, overly privileged individual that feels like every gamer is some form of inferior filth that might help with your popularity. Just a thought. Walker's first real argument is that Git Gud mutated from a meme to a quasi-religion, which is overseen by some elitist, exclusionary gatekeepers who maintain some form of goodness which is sealed under the catacombs of Paris. I know you probably can't believe me, but I shall now read to you this article out loud to prove that this guy does indeed write about Parisian catacombs and goodness. It's now a philosophy, perhaps even a religion, where only the worthy are welcome. Only those capable of matching some unspecified level of gaming skill are allowed to even play video games, and all others are outcasts, subhumans to spit upon. Then he continues. What level of good is good enough? Is there Le Grand Boss Fight stored in a vacuum-sealed container in the catacombs under Paris? The measure by which all goodness is verified? And then he tells us that it's a crowd you're in until you're not, because if you for once stop playing good enough, you're immediately excluded from some imaginary elitist cult that maintains the necessary level of goodness in gaming. If you're wondering, yes, the entire article sounds this delirious, which is also why I'm sparing you from going through this line by line. After John has successfully found his way out of the Parisian catacombs, he then decides to teach us something about empathy, explaining to us that if one day we have a broken thumb, I believe, we will finally understand what empathy means. But we won't understand so on our own, no. We will require a lot of therapy and time and coaching. And then we could interpret his metaphor as a metaphor for empathy. Yes, he does actually write that. Now you see what I mentioned by him probably receiving so much venom in his personal messages because he's busy writing stuff like that in his articles, and his readers probably don't like being talked down to like some empathyless subhumans. But that's neither here nor there. The entire point of this segment is that first of all, your gaming skill is something that is impossible to define, and that secondly, this isn't something that you have constantly, but something you can lose, after which you get thrown out of some kind of shadowy elite cabal that is allowed to talk about video games because of their gaming skill. And then the rest of the point is basically busy trying to insult people for lacking empathy. Yet the only person that John is insulting is himself, with lines like, "They can no more Git Gud than you can today with your owie finger." The point John is trying to make here is that apparently some people don't have enough skill to defeat a boss no matter what, yet as we find out, the only person on the planet Earth who lacks this skill is John himself, as he's going to admit in a few paragraphs. The final point of this entire segment is that players are apparently scared of difficult games being taken away from them, and that all of their reactions are born out of fear. Now, this is so outlandish that I won't even dignify that with a specific response, but the motif of players being scared of him taking away their boss fights is something that makes its way throughout the article, so we're probably going to have to talk about this collectively in the end, as this isn't the only paragraph where he accuses gamers of being scared. So let's unpack and deconstruct everything that John has told us here. We start out with his very first point, which is that skill in gaming is immeasurable. Actually, gaming skill is very easy to measure, and the skill that is necessary for you to participate in the debate is also very easy to measure. If you want to talk about the atmosphere, the story, the environments of a video game, you have to actually play that video game, or at least you need to have played the 3, 4, 5 predecessors of this game to have a good idea of how the environments and story is supposed to feel. The difficulty on which you play through those games is utterly irrelevant for that part, because no matter how easy the game was, no matter how impaired the gameplay was while you played the game, this still doesn't in any way, shape, or form affect how you experience the story or the environment or the artistic merit of the world design. If you want to talk about the gameplay, then you should play through the game ideally on normal difficulty. Playing on easy difficulty is also fine as long as it doesn't affect the gameplay to an extent where it becomes utterly unrecognizable, and obviously hard and hard difficulties are also fine, because at this point you'll have experienced the full gameplay package with everything it entails. If you played through on story, you can talk about gameplay, because story difficulties in video games usually butcher the entire gameplay just to make the game almost foolproof in how simple it is. And if you want to talk about competitive stuff, if you want to talk about speedrunning, etc., then you should probably be someone who does speedruns themselves or who is interested in speedruns. There is actually not that much of a difficulty in understanding what level of skill is necessary for your opinion to be taken serious in various communities in gaming. This is actually very easy to understand, so I don't comprehend why John chooses to muddy the waters here with his weird analogy in the catacombs under Paris. And what is also important to point out, what we are talking about here is the level of involvement in a game that is required for your opinion to be taken serious. You're allowed to have an opinion even when you've never touched the game. It's just that no one's going to care about your opinion. When you're talking about Elden Ring and you've never played any Souls-likes and you've never touched Elden Ring, then no one's going to take you serious. You're still allowed to have your opinion. Therefore, this skill hierarchy I just told you is only relevant for whether your opinions are going to be taken seriously, not for whether you're allowed to have any opinions, obviously. The other point that he's trying to make here is that some people are so incompetent with controllers that they apparently can't beat bosses in video games. At this point, it's rather relevant to keep in mind that we already have things like story difficulty. We have a lot of new accessibility options. Even in games like Elden Ring, you can use co-op if you can't overcome a boss. There's so many various options on how you can make the game easier. It is honestly impossible for me to imagine that in a modern game, someone can't overcome a boss. On story difficulty, probably even a toddler could overcome a boss in a modern video game, because they have just been made so accessible, and I'm not even against that. Why shouldn't someone be able to enjoy a game that has a strong narrative and a strong environment on story difficulty? Actual accessibility options can include additional sound cues for people who struggle with seeing, a colorblind mode, etc., etc., but certainly not just being able to press X to jump over some boss. This isn't additional accessibility, this is literally just erasing a part of the game's content. The final interesting point that John is making here, which he makes at the very beginning, but which is an important theme that goes throughout this opus of his, is that apparently gamers are evil because they're gatekeeping, they're exclusive, and they take pride in their achievements in video games. That's something that he quotes identically here in the very beginning. I hate it mostly, however, because aside from being gatekeeping, exclusionary, and ultimately about pride and selfishness, this argument is incoherent. The mistake that John is making here is assuming that the things he just mentioned are negative, but 3 of them are actually positive. Gatekeeping is a good thing, as it is necessary to maintain standards. Exclusiveness is also a good thing. Being exclusionary is therefore also a good thing. It's like gatekeeping, necessary to maintain standards. And ultimately, taking pride in your achievements in a video game is also a good thing. It shows that you take gaming serious. It shows that you're emotionally involved with what you're playing, and there's nothing negative about that as long as that pride doesn't take overhand. The only negative thing here is selfishness. And the only way you could believe that the argument that you should just get good and build your skills to overcome a challenge in a video game is selfish is if you maintain that warped and completely disconnected from reality perspective that John has, where he believes that an evil cabal of players who were able to defeat Malenia with a Guitar Hero controller are keeping a vacuum-sealed package of goodness in the catacombs under Paris. To understand why gatekeeping and being exclusionary is actually a good thing, we need to understand the very core of almost every product we see on a market today, the STP model. That stands for segmentation, targeting, positioning. Every product that is launched first must look for a segment of the market that it wants to appeal towards. Then it must target that segment, and then it must position itself in a way that that segment understands that this product is for them. With a video game, for example, when you have boss fights, you're automatically targeting a segment that wants boss fights in the video game. If you didn't want to target a segment that wants boss fights, you could make Stardew Valley, which doesn't have any boss fights. Then you would reach a more casual audience that wants a chill and very enjoyable farming sim, but you're probably not going to be targeting Elden Ring players. Of course, it can be that people from the Elden Ring segment still enjoy Stardew Valley and the other way around. But if you start trying to water down what your segment is about, when you start trying to water down your offer towards a certain part of the gamer population, in this case boss fights, and you want to make them skippable, you're watering down your offer, therefore lowering its quality, therefore weakening your targeting of this segment, and furthermore, also you're hurting your own positioning, because people are going to notice this and they're going to get angry because they'll feel like you lied to them. Because first you're positioning yourself as this cool game that has boss fights, and now you're suddenly moving away from this promise, offering to make boss fights skippable and that every boss fight will have a peaceful resolution, etc, etc, etc. You're weakening your position. And on top of that, you're also not going to reach anyone who doesn't want any boss fights, because why are they going to play a game that had boss fights to begin with? So what will happen is that you make a game that in the end will appeal to no one. This is a very core comprehension of marketing that John seems to fail to understand. But actually, gatekeeping and exclusionary behavior societally is the basis of almost everything we have. I don't understand why this column equates gatekeeping with moral rot, because in practice, we're gatekeeping everywhere. We have exclusionary behaviors in all parts of society. Surgeons need to pass exams. Drivers need to earn licenses. Even a bartender needs a license to pour you some alcohol. A boss fight is just a game's way to appeal to a certain segment and to be exclusive for this one segment, and that's not a bad thing because the other segments probably also have products which are made specifically for them. That's how a modern society works. That's how a modern market functions. We've spent a lot of time talking about this Git Gud segment in the Kotaku article, but it's honestly the strongest one, as incredible as it sounds, compared to the rest of the points that this author is making. Therefore, I decided to spend some more time on talking about the few points that seem somewhat relevant. Because when we're moving on, he's trying to debunk the point that a boss fight is an important test of a player's skill. This is one of the first moments where John's mask starts slipping, and he shows himself as someone who clearly doesn't like video games. There's this phrase here: Game X has had you learn how to do the 3 different punch attacks and the 4 different kick attacks, and that special move where you send some laser beam. This sounds so derogatory towards a core gameplay aspect that it shows to me that John just doesn't like video games, most likely. When John is caricaturing combat as 3 punches, 4 kicks and a laser, then that's just your drunk uncle describing Street Fighter 2. It belittles the hit confirms, animation cancels, the entire technique of staggering your opponent, combos, 90% of the actual gameplay. Every video game in the end comes down to you're mashing buttons. That's like telling me when I'm playing Total War that all I'm doing is selecting units and then clicking on random parts of the screen. Yes, but that's a gross oversimplification of what I'm actually doing when I'm playing that game. When someone treats the core aspect of the medium, namely the gameplay, so disrespectfully and as some irrelevant clutter, it's rather fair to suspect that they probably don't care about that medium at all. basically we can just throw out this argument that John is trying to make in his Kotaku article right here, because he clearly just doesn't understand the concept of gameplay within the medium of video games. But there is just one rather, interesting comparison that he makes. What if instead, midway through the book you're reading, you have to take an English lit examination? I found this segment so interesting because it basically undermines his entire attempt at building an argument that bosses aren't an important test of player skill. Because actually we do have literature where you have exams after every chapter. That's literally every university textbook ever. It is not uncommon indeed for there to be little exams of your skill when your skill is necessary for you to progress further in the field. That's why university textbook has those exams at the end of every chapter. It wants to make sure that you understood what you just read. And then it wants to make sure that you've got the foundation to move on towards the next chapter. It's not even just textbooks that follow this concept. Martial arts have bell tests, pilots have check rides. Wherever mastery matters, certain gates exist to check that mastery. Games are simply using a boss as the gate to check your mastery. I don't understand why he came up with this argument of books not using a lit exam in the middle of the book, because actually books do use a lit exam in the middle of the book if your literary skill matters to you comprehending the book. And of course you personally have the complete freedom to not take that lit exam in the middle of the book and just move on. And then you will probably learn absolutely nothing. That's your personal prerogative. But you don't get to demand that the chapter quizzes should be ripped out from every university textbook because you don't like the fact that they're there. At this point, John is just showing us that he doesn't like games. The next point, he tries to explain to us why indeed fighting a boss is not important to the story, because cutscenes also aren't that important to a story, as you can skip the cutscenes and you apparently don't lose anything, and you can also skip a boss and also not lose anything. This is the same as what he stated in the beginning of this previous point, where he tried to make gameplay an irrelevant part of video games. Now he's trying to make the story an irrelevant part of the video game. If you don't like the story of the video game, and if you think that the entire gameplay of a video game can be summed up as 4 different kick attacks and 1 special move, then why are you even playing video games, John? You literally just declared the 2 fundamental parts of video games irrelevant, the story and the gameplay. But let's entertain this argument a bit more. Let's assume that John's argument is correct and that skipping cutscenes is indeed completely harmless. You can't compare a cutscene, which is passive exposition, and you just lose a little bit of lore or some really good dialogue, with a boss fight, which is emotional payload forged through effort, if you want to just sum up what a boss fight is. A boss fight requires you to actively invest time, energy, commitment, skill into this one intensive moment, which is built up by usually great music, an impressive environment, this one big challenge you need to overcome to move forward. This is one of those big moments where you bond with a video game. I can also give you a great example because John used Malenia earlier. Malenia isn't that interesting of a character. Obviously she is when you know the lore, but when people first met her in the healing tree where she was sleeping and waiting for Mikola, we didn't really know all that much about her, but she still turned into this internet phenomenon, which there are animations that probably together have over 100 million views on YouTube, which show her boss fight. There are thousands of pieces of fan art made of her, even though she barely talks to you, even though you barely get to know her as a character. You literally don't have any conversation with her, and the one phrase that almost everyone remembers is her telling us that she's the blade of Mikola for 1,000 times. Then why are we suddenly feeling such a strong emotional connection with Malenia? Well, it's because we all had to invest a lot of time, effort, energy into overcoming her. And it is a core fundament of human psychology that we build bonds based on the amount of time and commitment and energy that we pour into something. We only care about things that, well, we invested ourselves into. That is rather obvious. And Malenia is a great example of how a boss fight forges this connection to a video game. Because if you've been trying to defeat her for 2, 3, 4 hours, then you've poured a lot of time, effort, energy into overcoming her, into overcoming this challenge of defeating her, and then when you finally manage to get out through the first phase, and then she enters her second phase and turns to the Rotflower, on the one hand, you're so elated that you finally overcame the first phase, and then you immediately get the emotional whiplash, oh no, I'm going to need to invest even more effort, even more time into overcoming her. And this just built such a strong bond with Elden Ring, which is why she also became a fan favorite immediately, even though there is not really that much in a classic psychological sense to build a parasocial relationship. There are no dialogues. There is no conventional reason for you to have a parasocial bond with her as a video game character. But almost all of us who played Elden Ring do, and the reason for that is the amount of effort and energy we all had to invest to overcome the challenge that she posed. I know I've been riding around on this point for a long time, but this is a very essential part of game design. A lot of game design circles around making the player commit, about making the player want to commit energy, time, effort into engaging with your medium. And Malenia is a great example of how this has been done perfectly. And now when we circle back to the argument John is trying to make, that skipping a boss fight is irrelevant, basically just like skipping a cutscene, no it isn't. Even if we follow your outlandish idea that cutscenes are irrelevant to the game, we still need to make clear that there's a difference between a passive cutscene where there is no effort expected from you and an important moment of you emotionally bonding with the video game by investing effort into overcoming a challenge. If you don't want to do that, then either the game is very bad and has failed at being a product that makes you want to engage with it, which is a failure on the game side, or you just don't want to engage with the video game as a player, and then the product is probably just not made for you. Which, honestly, John, I'm starting to believe that there are no games that are made for you based on how you talk and based on you not instinctually understanding what I've just spent 5 minutes describing with the Malenia boss fight. The upcoming paragraph finally reveals the reason for this mindless crusade against boss fights in video games. Apparently, John once had to quit Metroid Prime 2 after dying to Chica the Moth 27 times, and he has never come back to the game since. And now, 2 decades later, the space insect still flaps in his nightmares, and this is powering this crusade to staple panic doors onto any future boss fight. This entire article that I just spent 25 minutes analyzing because it was released in Kotaku and apparently was a good faith attempt at improving the gaming medium turned out to just be a single man's trauma dumping because he lost to a space moth in a video game 20 years ago. I will read a phrase out loud again because this is actually very important to understand the psychology of the author of this article. And that was it. I spent so many miserable hours fighting that hateful insect. When I finally defeated its first stage, I was horrified to learn I wasn't even halfway through. And worse, failure at this point, when faced with all new attack patterns to learn, meant returning to the very beginning again. I never even saw the third stage of the fight. I couldn't do it. It was beyond my skills in 2004, and as such, I never got to play the second half of one of my favorite games ever. This segment is important, and this phrase is very important because I believe it perfectly encapsulates all of games journalism. It shows that this is a field full of people who can't play video games, who don't really like video games, as I showed to you throughout us going through this article step by step, when we saw that he was trying to ridicule and demean gameplay as basically just having 3 different attacks and 1 super laser, when he was trying to explain to us that cutscenes are basically irrelevant and you can skip them without losing anything, and therefore you can also skip a boss fight without losing anything, because he just doesn't appreciate the emotional connection you feel towards the game by investing yourself into enjoying this medium. What this moth segment shows is that even 2 decades ago, this man wasn't someone who played video games a lot, nor was he someone who actually was willing to commit to a video game. He's someone who would drop out of a game that he claims was one of his favorite games of all time. If it actually was, he'd have come back to this boss fight with the moth the next day, and the day after, and the day after, until he overcame this Chica creature, instead of now, 20 years later, starting some weird crusade against boss fights in video games. Apart from the segment with Chica the Moth, which is a very interesting look at the psyche of a games journalist, there's nothing really interesting in this segment. The main argumentative point here is that apparently 97% of a game is fighting mobs and doing other stuff, while only 3% are boss fights, and therefore you should be able to cut out all the boss fights. My Malenia example from earlier still applies here. Bosses aren't just some random 3% of a game, they are the core pillars that carry the experience. Overcoming a boss is a moment where you invest a lot of energy and time into achieving something. This bonds you with the game. And overcoming the boss, this is something I didn't mention with my Malenia example earlier, overcoming the boss is also a massive moment of success. This is the payoff for 10, 15 hours of you leveling, going through the open world, doing side quests, gaining skills, you yourself gaining skills and your character gaining skills, you overcoming smaller challenges. All of this led up to this massive climax of you fighting and defeating that boss. The pure rush of elation when you overcome a well-made boss is difficult to describe to a non-gamer like John, but it's a great feeling. It's like passing a difficult exam with an A. It's like managing your first 10 kilometers in one go during marathon training. It's a rush of endorphin that for a moment makes you feel like you could take on the entire world. This is the reason why genres like Souls-likes are actually so successful. It's because people are craving this sense of achievement, of attainment, of having overcome a boss. Yet here you have John trying to argue that bosses are just 3% of a game and therefore irrelevant. Yes, they are just 3% of a game, but they are the 3% of a game that make the other 97% of the game actually meaningful. We will skip John's next point for now, as it is basically the same argument he makes in the end and in his conclusion, therefore I'll just talk about it then. The next to last point he makes, which has nothing to do with games to be honest, is that developers' intent doesn't matter because he has linked a PDF to death of the author. John's strategy here is to wave around Roland Barthes to claim that developer intent is utterly irrelevant, but Barthes said that interpretation isn't owned by the author, not that readers may carve out chapters wholesale. You can interpret a painting differently, that's fine, but you can't demand the curator to cut off the face of the Mona Lisa because you don't like it. Similarly, interpreting a boss as some personal Everest or interpreting Malenia's role in Elden Ring differently is completely fine, that's your prerogative, but insisting that the devs need to add a skip challenge button is completely different because it's vandalizing the genre. And furthermore, what John is ignoring here is that Death of the Author argues for a deeply personal thing, namely your interpretation of a piece of literature. This doesn't affect anyone else. How you interpret something that you read is your highly personal matter. What John is suggesting here isn't that he should be allowed to personally interpret a boss fight differently. What he's trying to do here is he's trying to force all of us to live with a massive change to game design philosophy as a whole because he couldn't defeat a moth in a 20-year-old game. This difference between your highly personal sphere and you attempting to invade other people's personal sphere that John doesn't seem to understand is very important and ties perfectly into his own conclusion, where he first of all mentions that him playing a game differently doesn't affect anyone else, that people are once again apparently scared that he will see the credits of a game without having to overcome a boss, and that generally him playing differently doesn't take anything away from anyone. In the end, John is painting this picture that when he is at home on his couch playing a video game that doesn't take anything away from anyone else, no matter how he plays, no matter what he changes, if it's a single player game it doesn't affect anyone. John is completely correct with this assumption, there is nothing to add. But this made me understand how weird his entire article here is, because he could have just modded Chica out of Metroid Prime 2 without annoying anyone else with this article, and this would be over. He could finish Metroid Prime 2. He could go on YouTube, watch the ending, and he could see the credits of Metroid Prime 2. If he doesn't have the technical skill to mod Chica out of the game, if apparently not being able to skip bosses is such a massive problem for the gaming community, then I'm sure he will find hundreds, nay thousands of mods which allow you to skip bosses. And if he can't find them, then apparently this isn't such a major problem in the community as he seems to believe. Then maybe he can pay someone who is more programming savvy to get rid of Chica for him, and then he can finally finish the game. If he doesn't want to pay someone to mod out Chica, I'm sure that some free cheat engine like Wiimote offers some form of God mode for Metroid Prime 2, then he could also overcome Chica. Thinking about it, it's pretty weird that John feels the necessity to tell all of us in the world in an article released in one of the biggest gaming outlets on Earth that we need to add skip buttons to boss fights, when he himself maintains that how he plays his game in private is none of our business. I don't know whether anyone actually tried to forbid him from cheating his way through the Chica fight, but I don't have any problem with that. I personally didn't even know that this John Walker person failed to overcome a moth in Metroid Prime 2 20 years ago, and I honestly still don't really care. If he wants to use any method that he wishes to use to overcome this boss in a single player game, I don't care. It's none of my business. He's completely correct with that. But I don't understand why he felt the urge to make this problem all of our business by releasing an article in Kotaku. I believe that John doesn't want to make games more accessible. I know, shocker, this was pretty obvious. But I believe that what he's really looking for is some sense of developer absolution, because he is indeed so entitled as a games journalist that he believes that the entire industry must cater to him. Because he could easily overcome Chica by cheating. I'm almost 100% sure that there's cheats for Metroid Prime 2 on Wiimote. But he didn't want to do that. And the reason why he didn't want to do that is because he didn't want to have the stigma of being a bad player because he had to cheat to overcome a boss. He didn't want to feel dirty because he used some underhanded tactic to overcome a boss. He wanted to have a get out of jail free card provided to him by the developer so that he doesn't have to feel bad. He wanted to have that escape button. This is something that's important to keep in mind here, and something I realized with his own argument that how he plays his game is his personal matter. If you don't want to overcome a boss in a multiplayer game, where skippable bosses would obviously be impossible, if you want to overcome a boss in a single player game, you can always just cheat. When you put it very simply, this entire article reads like a gaming journalist coping and seething because he couldn't defeat Chica, and that he's now demanding that the entirety of gaming needs to kneel before him and offer him a get-out-of-jail-free card because he couldn't defeat a boss, and he doesn't want to sully himself with a non-real gamer action like cheating. This very transparent core premise of the article, as well as the author's very derogatory, unnecessarily bloomy, verbose, and just constantly snobby language really don't paint him in a very positive picture. Especially also things that make it seem like you just dislike games, John. You're pointing out that basically the entirety of gameplay in a fighting game is 3 kicks and 4 punches. You mentioned that dialogue is more or less disposable. You paint bosses as some arbitrary cruelty throughout the entire game, even though they are just a part of games that have bosses. And you then spend a full segment explaining to us that developer vision is irrelevant. If that's your worldview, then you just sound like you don't care about games. That's not me trying to insult you, that's just textual evidence that you provided to us. Maybe you should cover media you actually love instead of sanding off everything that defines this one. I really don't know whether you have proofreaders at Kotaku, but if you had some good colleague, they really should have taken you to the side and told you, do you really want to release this to an audience of gamers? Because this really doesn't make you seem like a likable person to a gamer. It makes you seem like a very entitled person who feels like all of gamerdom needs to kneel before you and accommodate your special wishes to skip bosses, while you can't even be bothered to not come off as a haughty, elitist snob who views all of us with an incredible level of disdain. I just once again remind you of this phrase you wrote: with a lot of therapy and time, you might understand that you having an owie finger now is maybe how other people feel, and they can maybe not mash this button as fast as you can. You make us sound like some form of empathyless, evil creature, while at the same time also denigrating all of gaming to just be some button mashing, and then you want our sympathy and that we accommodate you and get rid of boss fights. I don't know who at Kotaku told you that it was a good idea to release this article, but you're very lucky that your website barely has any readers, because it really doesn't make you look good. And I don't mean this as an insult, I just mean this as an observation. Alright, let's just recap why bosses are so important and shouldn't be skippable. They are a structural keystone to every game. They are the very core of the experience you need to overcome, the challenge that you build your skill for, that you gather XP for, that you get better equipment for. And if they shouldn't be this important challenge for you to overcome, then there are hundreds of genres which don't have bosses. Bosses actually aren't that common in video games. If you feel like you can't overcome a boss, then there's already a lot of accessibility options all the way down to story difficulty in modern games, which already scale the difficulty without deleting your interaction with the medium. But all of these arguments don't matter because John's crusade is based on some moth from 20 years ago that he couldn't defeat. Anyways, if you enjoyed this autopsy of journalistic gymnastics, smash the like, punch subscribe, ring the bell so YouTube doesn't skip my boss fight with the algorithm, and drop your hardest won victory in the comments. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and of course, stay toasty. Cheers!